So last week was really about identifying arguments, thinking about what arguments are, what their elements are, the difference between an argument and a non argument. This week we begin the process of evaluating arguments, criticizing them, saying whether they're good arguments or bad arguments. And one of the key terms in doing that, evaluating arguments, is validity. So we're asking whether an argument is valid or not when we're talking about validity. And when we're talking about validity and we're asking ourselves whether an argument is valid, we're asking ourselves this question: does the conclusion actually follow from the premises? If the answer to that is yes, then the argument is valid. If the answer to that is no, then the argument is invalid. Let's take a look at a sample argument. All men are mortal. That's premise one. Socrates is a man. That's premise two. Therefore, conclusion indicator, Socrates is mortal. So, in asking ourselves whether this particular argument is valid or invalid, what we're asking is whether the statement Socrates is mortal actually follows from the preceding two statements, the premises all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. Well, intuitively, sure, it does actually follow. In fact, it follows with necessity. This is a deductive argument. A deductive argument is an argument where the conclusion follows in the premises with necessity. And what does that mean, with necessity? Well, if we say with necessity, what we're saying is that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That is, there is no universe in which the premises are true and the conclusion is not true. That's the test of a valid deductive argument. So if we look back here, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If the first two are true, then the third, Socrates is mortal, the first two statements are true, then the third statement, Socrates is mortal, must be true. That is, there's no possibility of it being false if the premises are true. So that's validity, as far as I think. I don't know. I mean, think it through for yourself. Um, at least that's deductive validity, as opposed to an inductive argument. But we'll talk a little bit about what he has to say about inductive arguments. But um, here's another valid argument. A perfectly, it has the very same form as the Socrates argument. Perfectly valid deductive argument. All birds are pigs. Jim is a bird, therefore Jim is a pig. So when we say that it's valid, what are we saying? Well, we're saying that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. We are not saying that the premises are true. What we are saying is that if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows from them. Meaning, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So this argument here about Jim, birds, and pigs, this is a valid argument by our definition. It is not a sound one. It is not a sound argument. What does soundness mean? Soundness is just another term of art for arguments. Uh, a sound argument is a valid argument. So sound arguments are valid. And when we say that an argument is sound, we say also that all its premises are true. So what does that tell us? A sound argument, if we put the two things together, is an argument in which the conclusion is true. I mean, that's true of it. Maybe not true of all. Certainly not true of all arguments. Some arguments in which the conclusion is true are invalid. But this one here, we're basically saying if an argument is sound, then it's valid, its reasoning is good, its conclusion actually follows from the premises, and the premises are true. So, really, a sound argument is the gold standard of arguments, right? Where the premises are good, they're true, and the reasoning is good. That is, the conclusion actually follows from the premises. But one of the things that are rather disappointingly, but maybe just honestly, our author tells us is that he is not going to be concerned with soundness. Why not? Simple reason. And that is this. Because determining the truth of premises, and remember, a sound argument is by definition one in which all the premises are true. Because determining the truth of premises has nothing to do with logic, which kind of teaches you something about what logic is. I know, for instance, that here and now in September 2024, Biden is president of the USA. That I'm sure is a true statement. But it has nothing to do with logic. Right? It's an empirical statement. It's an observation about the world. Statements can be true or false, but how we determine whether they're true or false has nothing to do, in themselves, like bare statements, has nothing to do with logic. What is logic? Well, let's look at a couple pairs of statements. Random statements. The birds in the zoo live in cages. Uh, the birds in the zoo live in cages. The prize for grabbing the brass ring is a free ride. Two random statements just popped out of my subconscious. We don't know if those statements are true or false. We'd have to think about it. Um, but we can see something about the relation between the statements, and that is that they have nothing to do with each other. They don't. They don't imply anything. They're just like independent statements. They're in no real logical relationship. Compare this pair of statements with this one. If Jim is eating breakfast, then it must be Tuesday. Jim is eating breakfast. Those two statements have a different sort of relationship. They have some relationship, where these two statements here about the birds and the prize, they don't have any real relationship. Nothing that immediately pops out. Although this is different. That is, if the first statement is true and the second statement is true, then the logic sort of pops out at you. Well, if one is true and the other is true, then a third must be true. So there's something appears here about what logic is. Logic is not about whether a particular statement is true. Logic is about the relationship between statements, independent of whether they're actually true. I mean, both of these statements could be false about if Jim eating breakfast and it must be Tuesday and Jim actually eating breakfast. It doesn't matter if they're false. They work together to imply something, and that is the conclusion it is Tuesday. So logic is not about really whether a statement is true. And logic is about the logical relationship between statements, about whether or not they actually imply other statements, whether or not you can make an inference from them. There's no inference to be made. Birds in the zoo live in cages. The prize for grabbing the brass ring is a free ride. Therefore, nothing is implied. If Jim is eating breakfast, then it must be Tuesday. Jim is eating breakfast, so it's Tuesday. Something else happens there. That's really what logic, or part of what logic is. So I just want to say that this whole thing about soundness, and we're